The Unreliable Witness, Uncovering the Hidden Truth, a psychological thriller story. Detective Sarah Bennett stood outside the crime scene, her gaze fixed on the grand mansion before her. The imposing stone building was surrounded by yellow police tape, fluttering slightly in the breeze. The air was heavy with the usual hum of activity, officers coming in and out, forensics combing through evidence, and curious neighbors watching from a distance. But amid the chaos, Sarah's mind was already racing with questions. Ethan Hayes, a wealthy and controversial businessman, had been found dead in his own home. His body was discovered by his housekeeper early that morning, lying on the floor of his study, a pool of blood beneath him. The initial report suggested multiple stab wounds, but there was something more to the scene, something unsettling that Sarah couldn't quite put her finger on. "Detective Bennett," called Officer Paul Reynolds, walking briskly toward her. "The forensics team is ready for you inside." Sarah nodded and followed him into the mansion. The grandeur of the place did nothing to ease the weight of what lay ahead. Expensive paintings lined the walls, and the scent of polished wood filled the air. Everything about the house screamed wealth, but it also whispered secrets. In the study, Ethan's body had already been removed, but the outline of where he had fallen was marked by tape. Blood spattered the walls, and the papers on his desk were scattered, some torn as if there had been a struggle. Sarah's eyes scanned the room carefully. "Any sign of forced entry?" she asked, turning to Officer Reynolds. "None," he replied. "Doors and windows were all locked. It looks like someone knew the house well or had been invited in." Sarah's mind began to formulate theories, but they all fell short without more evidence. "Any witnesses?" Reynolds hesitated. "Yes, but it's complicated." Sarah raised an eyebrow. "Complicated how?" He sighed. "Jacob Turner. He's the victim's neighbor and apparently saw something. But he's got some memory issues. Keeps talking about blackouts and says he might have seen the killer, but his account is all over the place." Sarah frowned. "Where is he?" "Down at the station. Captain O'Connor thought you should talk to him personally." "Of course," Sarah replied. She had heard of Jacob Turner before. He was known around the neighborhood for his odd behavior. She'd also heard rumors of his mental health issues, but this would be her first time meeting him in person. "Let me finish up here," she said to Reynolds, "then I'll head over." Sarah took one last look at the room. It was the kind of murder that made headlines, especially given Ethan's high-profile business dealings. The media would be all over this soon enough. She needed answers and fast. But the truth would soon prove far more elusive than she ever imagined. The small, dimly lit interrogation room at the police station was a stark contrast to the grandeur of the mansion. Jacob Turner sat at the table, his hands clasped in his lap, eyes downcast. He looked disheveled, his brown hair messy and his clothes wrinkled. His expression was distant, almost vacant, as if he was lost in his own world. Detective Sarah Bennett entered the room and sat across from him. She studied him carefully, noting the slight tremor in his hands and the way his gaze flickered nervously around the room. "Jacob," Sarah began, her voice gentle but firm, "I'm Detective Sarah Bennett. I understand you may have witnessed something last night at Ethan Hayes' house. Can you tell me what happened?" Jacob lifted his eyes to meet hers, and for a moment, there was a flash of something. Fear, confusion, guilt? Sarah couldn't tell. I don't know," he murmured, his voice shaky. "I was outside near his house. I saw something, but everything's blurry. It's like pieces are missing." Sarah leaned forward slightly, her tone remaining calm. "That's okay. Just tell me what you do remember. Anything could help." Jacob hesitated, rubbing his temples as if trying to piece together fragmented memories. "There was a light on in the study. I saw shadows. Someone was there. I don't know. There was shouting, I think. And then blood. So much blood. But it's all mixed up. I don't know what's real." Sarah glanced at the two-way mirror behind her. Dr. Emily Clark, Jacob's psychiatrist, had mentioned his dissociative identity disorder, a condition where his mind fractured into multiple identities, sometimes causing memory gaps. If Jacob had been a witness, how much of what he saw could be trusted? Jacob, Sarah said slowly, do you remember if anyone else was with you? Did you see the killer? Jacob's face tensed and his fingers gripped the edge of the table. I saw someone, but I don't know who. His breathing grew shallow and panic flashed in his eyes. Sometimes I black out. Sometimes there's another me. He's stronger, more confident. Maybe he saw something, but I didn't. The room grew quiet. Sarah could feel the frustration building inside her. An unreliable witness, one who couldn't even trust his own mind, was not what she needed right now. But it was all she had. Dr. Emily Clark stepped into the room, sensing Jacob's distress. Detective Bennett, she said softly, that's enough for now. We'll need more time to help him recall what happened. Sarah stood up, feeling the weight of the case pressing down on her. Thank you, Dr. Clark. Jacob, if you remember anything else, no matter how small, please let me know. Jacob nodded weakly, his eyes drifting away again, lost in the maze of his own fractured mind. As Sarah left the room, her mind swirled with unanswered questions. The clock was ticking, and with every passing moment, the truth seemed further out of reach. She needed a lead, something solid to connect the pieces of this tangled web. But with Jacob Turner as her only witness, she wasn't sure if the truth would ever fully come to light. Detective Sarah Bennett walked out of the interrogation room, her thoughts swirling like a storm. Jacob Turner was her only witness, but his mind was a labyrinth of uncertainty. She leaned against the wall for a moment, taking a deep breath, trying to process the case. If Jacob's dissociative identity disorder had fragmented his memories, piecing together the truth would be like assembling a puzzle with missing pieces. As she headed toward her office, Captain Michael O'Connor appeared from around the corner. His sharp eyes fixed on her, his usual no-nonsense expression in place. How did it go? He asked, folding his arms across his chest. Complicated, Sarah replied with a sigh. Jacob remembers being near the crime scene, but his memory is fragmented. He mentioned seeing someone, but he's not sure if it was real or if it was part of one of his blackouts. O'Connor grunted in frustration. We don't have time for this. The press is already circling like vultures, and the longer this drags on, the worse it's going to look. Hayes was a powerful figure in the business world. We need results. I know, Sarah said, her voice firm. But rushing Jacob isn't going to help. He's fragile. We need to handle this carefully if we're going to get anything useful out of him. O'Connor's eyes softened slightly. Just keep me updated. The pressure's building. As he walked away, Sarah's phone buzzed in her pocket. She pulled it out and saw Dr. Emily Clark's name on the screen. The psychiatrist was calling her back sooner than she had expected. Detective Bennett, Dr. Clark's calm voice came through the line. I've been thinking about Jacob's condition and his account of what he witnessed. I believe we might be able to access some of his blocked memories through hypnotherapy. Hypnotherapy? Sarah repeated, surprised. You think that could work? It's not a guarantee, Dr. Clark explained, but it's worth trying. Jacob's mind might have suppressed the details of what happened, but with the right guidance, we could help him recall what he saw that night. Sarah considered the idea. Hypnotherapy was unconventional, but in a case like this, she didn't have the luxury of dismissing any potential lead. Jacob's mind was fractured, but if they could unlock even a small part of his memory, it might give them the break they needed. Let's set it up, Sarah said. We don't have much time. Later that evening, Sarah sat in Dr. Clark's office as the psychiatrist prepared Jacob for the session. The room was quiet, the lights dimmed to create a calm atmosphere. Jacob sat in a reclined chair, his body tense but his eyes closed, following Dr. Clark's soothing instructions to relax. Take a deep breath, Jacob. Dr. Clark's voice was soft, almost a whisper. I want you to focus on your breathing. In and out. Let your mind drift, but stay with me. We're going to revisit that night, but you're safe here. Just let the memories come as they will. Jacob's face twitched slightly, as though the effort of relaxing was a strain in itself. Sarah watched intently, her heart beating faster with anticipation. This could be the breakthrough they needed. Jacob, Dr. Clark continued, you're outside Ethan Hayes' house. It's the night of the murder. You're near the study window. Tell me what you see. For a moment nothing happened. Jacob's breathing remained steady, and his hands lay still in his lap. But then, his brow furrowed and his fingers twitched, as if he were reaching for something just out of his grasp. There's a light, Jacob murmured. In the study. I see shadows. 2 people. Arguing. Can you hear what they're saying? Dr. Clark asked gently. Jacob's face tightened, his eyes squeezing shut as if the memory was painful. They're shouting. I can't hear the words, but they're angry. Sarah leaned forward, hanging on every word. Who is in the room, Jacob? Dr. Clark asked. Jacob's breathing quickened. His hands clenched into fists. It's Ethan Hayes, and someone else. Someone with a knife. Can you see who it is? Jacob's face contorted with fear. No, I can't see their face. It's like there's a fog. I can't remember. His body tensed and his breathing became shallow, rapid. Dr. Clark noticed the change and immediately began to bring him out of the trance. Jacob, it's okay. You're safe. Come back now. Slowly take a deep breath and open your eyes. Jacob gasped as he woke from the trance, his eyes wide with panic. His body shook, and he gripped the armrests of the chair tightly, as though he were trying to hold onto something solid. Sarah sighed, her heart sinking. They were so close to getting more details, but Jacob's mind had blocked out the most crucial part, the identity of the second person in the room. Dr. Clark gave Jacob a moment to calm down before speaking softly. You did well, Jacob. We made progress. But it's okay to stop for now. Jacob nodded weakly, his face pale and drawn. I don't know if I'll ever remember, he whispered, his voice filled with defeat. Sarah stood and placed a hand on his shoulder. We'll figure it out, Jacob. You've already helped more than you realize. As Sarah and Dr. Clark stepped out of the room, Sarah's mind buzzed with unanswered questions. Jacob had seen someone with Ethan that night, but his fractured memory had blurred the details. There was no clear lead, no face, just an elusive figure hidden behind a fog of trauma. But as they walked toward the exit, Sarah's phone rang again. This time it was Officer Paul Reynolds. Detective Bennett? His voice was urgent. We found something. You'll want to get down here right away. Sarah's heart raced. Maybe they had finally uncovered a solid lead. She hurried out the door, her thoughts consumed with the pieces of the puzzle she had yet to fit together. The night had fallen by the time Sarah reached the station. The corridors were quiet, but the air was thick with tension as Officer Reynolds met her at the entrance, his face serious. What is it? Sarah asked, following him toward the evidence room. Reynolds opened the door and handed her a sealed evidence bag. Inside was a small, blood-stained note. The handwriting was shaky, barely legible, but the words sent a chill down Sarah's spine. I know what you did. You won't get away with this. Where did this come from? Sarah asked, her voice tight with urgency. We found it at Ethan Hayes' house, Reynolds replied. It was hidden behind one of the paintings in his study. Looks like it was deliberately placed there, but the forensics team almost missed it. Sarah examined the note closely. It was brief, but it was a clear threat. Someone knew what Ethan had done, something that had pushed them to murder. But who? And what was Ethan guilty of? Any leads on the handwriting? Sarah asked. Not yet, Reynolds replied. We're running it through our system, but it could take a while. Sarah sighed, feeling the weight of the case growing heavier. First, Jacob's unreliable testimony, and now this cryptic note. The pieces were starting to come together, but the picture was still incomplete. As Sarah and Reynolds continued to discuss the case, her phone buzzed once again. This time it was Dr. Clark. Detective, Dr. Clark's voice was cautious. There's something I need to tell you about Jacob. It's important. Sarah's heart sank. She had a feeling that the road ahead was about to get much darker. Detective Sarah Bennett paced back and forth in her office, the blood-stained note resting on her desk. The more she thought about it, the more questions it raised. Who was behind this threat? And how did it connect to Ethan Hayes' murder? Her phone buzzed again, a reminder of Dr. Clark's earlier call. She needed to follow up on whatever Dr. Clark had to say about Jacob. If there was anything more to uncover about his disorder or his involvement that night, Sarah needed to know. Jacob's testimony was unreliable, but there was still a chance his fractured mind held the truth. She dialed Dr. Clark's number and waited. The psychiatrist picked up almost immediately. "Detective Bennett," Dr. Clark began, her tone professional but with a hint of concern. "I've been reviewing Jacob's records, and there's something I didn't mention earlier. Jacob's dissociative identity disorder is more severe than I initially thought." "What do you mean?" Sarah asked, sitting down, her focus sharpening. "Jacob has developed multiple personalities over the years," Dr. Clark explained. "One of these personalities may be involved in what happened that night at Ethan Hayes' house. It's possible that Jacob himself is unaware of it." "Another personality?" Sarah repeated, her mind racing. "Are you suggesting one of these personalities could have been the one who witnessed the murder, or worse, committed it?" "It's possible," Dr. Clark replied cautiously. "The personality might have emerged during one of Jacob's blackouts. If that's the case, Jacob wouldn't remember any of it. We may be dealing with a deeply hidden part of his mind." Sarah took a deep breath, trying to process this new information. The idea that Jacob had another personality, one capable of actions he didn't remember, opened up a whole new layer of complexity. "Can we identify this other personality?" Sarah asked. "Is there a way to draw it out?" "It's difficult," Dr. Clark said, "but there are techniques we can try. If we can get Jacob into a state where his alternate personalities emerge, we might be able to learn more. However, it's risky. Jacob's mind is fragile, and pushing him too hard could cause further damage." Sarah considered the situation. If one of Jacob's personalities had witnessed or even committed the murder, it was crucial they uncovered it. But she couldn't risk breaking Jacob's mind in the process. "Let's proceed cautiously," Sarah decided. "But we have to try. We need answers, and this might be the only way to get them." Later that day, Sarah met Dr. Clark at the psychiatric facility where Jacob was staying. The atmosphere was calm, but Sarah could feel the tension in the air as they prepared for the session. Dr. Clark had warned her that this would be delicate, but Sarah was determined to get to the truth. Jacob sat in a reclined chair once again, his eyes nervous but trusting as Dr. Clark explained what they were about to do. His hands fidgeted in his lap, a sign of the anxiety brewing inside him. "Jacob," Dr. Clark said gently, "we're going to try to speak to the part of you that was there that night. I want you to focus on your breathing again and let your mind relax." Jacob nodded hesitantly, closing his eyes as he tried to follow her instructions. "Let your thoughts drift," Dr. Clark continued, her voice soothing. "We're going back to that night again. You're outside Ethan Hayes' house, watching through the window. But this time, I want you to let the person who was there come forward. Let them speak." For several minutes there was silence. Jacob's breathing was slow and steady, his face relaxed. But then his body tensed, his fingers curling into fists. His face contorted into a grimace, and his voice, when it finally came out, was different, lower, more forceful. "You shouldn't be here," the voice growled. Sarah's heart skipped a beat. This wasn't Jacob. This was someone else, a different personality, the one they had been trying to reach. "Who are you?" Dr. Clark asked calmly, though there was a clear edge to her voice now. "I'm the one who protects him," the voice said. "I keep him safe." "Safe from what?" Dr. Clark asked. "From the world," the voice replied. "From the people who want to hurt him. Like that man, Ethan Hayes. He got what he deserved." Sarah's pulse quickened. "Did you kill him?" she asked, unable to keep the urgency out of her voice. The personality sneered. I did what needed to be done. He was going to ruin everything. He was going to expose the truth. What truth? Sarah pressed, leaning forward. The personality laughed, a dark and unsettling sound. The truth about Jacob. About who he really is. Ethan knew too much. Sarah's mind raced. Ethan Hayes had been involved in something that threatened Jacob, something that had cost him his life. But what could Ethan have known that made him a target? Before she could ask any more questions, Jacob's body went limp, and his breathing returned to normal. His eyes fluttered open, confused and disoriented. Did it happen again? Jacob asked weakly, looking between Sarah and Dr. Clark. You don't remember? Sarah asked gently. Jacob shook his head. No, it's all blank. Sarah exchanged a glance with Dr. Clark, who gave a subtle nod. They had made a breakthrough, but the pieces were still scattered. There was a hidden truth about Jacob that Ethan Hayes had uncovered, and it had cost him his life. But what was this truth? And how did it connect to the murder? As Sarah drove back to the station, her mind buzzed with the new revelation. Jacob's alternate personality had confessed to killing Ethan Hayes, but the reasons behind it were still shrouded in mystery. What was the truth that Hayes had discovered about Jacob, and why had it led to murder? When Sarah arrived at her office, she found Captain O'Connor waiting for her, his face serious. Any progress? He asked, his voice tight with impatience. We're getting closer, Sarah replied, sitting down at her desk. Jacob's alternate personality admitted to the killing, but it's still not clear why. Hayes knew something about Jacob, something that made him a threat. O'Connor frowned. What could Hayes have known? I don't know yet, Sarah admitted, her frustration growing. But whatever it was enough to make Jacob's mind fracture even more. O'Connor sat down across from her, rubbing his temples in thought. We need to dig deeper into Ethan Hayes' life. If he had any connection to Jacob before this, it might give us a clue. Start by looking into his personal records, financial dealings, anything that might link him to Jacob. I'll get right on it, Sarah said, standing up. As she began her search, her thoughts kept returning to the cryptic note they had found behind the painting in Hayes' study. I know what you did. You won't get away with this. Who had written it? Was it Jacob's alternate personality, or was there someone else involved in this tangled web? And what had Hayes done to warrant such a warning? Hours later, after combing through Hayes' financial records and emails, Sarah's eyes landed on something strange. A series of payments made to a psychiatric facility 2 years ago. The payments had been made regularly, and the name associated with them sent a chill down Sarah's spine. Jacob Turner. Sarah sat back in her chair, her mind reeling. Ethan Hayes had been paying for Jacob's psychiatric treatment for years. But why? What was their connection? As Sarah stared at the screen, a sinking feeling grew in her stomach. The pieces were starting to fall into place, but the picture they were forming was far darker than she had imagined. Ethan Hayes hadn't just been a random victim. He had been involved in Jacob's life for years, long enough to know whatever secret Jacob was hiding. The truth, it seemed, was far more dangerous than Sarah had anticipated. The revelation of Ethan Hayes funding Jacob Turner's psychiatric treatment was a bombshell, one that Sarah couldn't ignore. It tied their lives together in a way she hadn't anticipated, deepening the mystery of why Hayes was murdered. But now, Sarah needed to understand the nature of their relationship, how much Ethan knew about Jacob's condition and the truth that had led to his murder. Sarah leaned back in her chair, staring at the payment records. Her mind raced, connecting dots that had seemed unrelated before. Could Ethan have been Jacob's benefactor, helping him out of guilt or fear? Or was he controlling Jacob for some darker reason? She pulled up the psychiatric facility's records, narrowing down the dates of the payments. As she scanned through the documents, one entry stood out: Dr. Harold Lawson. He had been Jacob's primary psychiatrist before Dr. Clark had taken over. Sarah quickly dialed the facility's number, asking to speak with Dr. Lawson. After a brief wait, an older man's voice came through the line. Dr. Lawson speaking. Dr. Lawson, this is Detective Sarah Bennett. I'm investigating a case involving one of your former patients, Jacob Turner. I need to ask you some questions about his treatment and his connection to Ethan Hayes. There was a pause on the other end. I'm not sure how much I can tell you, Detective. Jacob's case is highly sensitive. I understand, Sarah said, her tone firm. But Ethan Hayes is dead and Jacob is our key witness. We've uncovered evidence that suggests Hayes was involved in Jacob's treatment. This is a murder investigation, Doctor, and we need the truth. Dr. Lawson sighed. Very well. Ethan Hayes wasn't just funding Jacob's treatment, he was involved in it. Hayes was the one who brought Jacob to the facility in the first place. He claimed to be a family friend, but I suspected there was more to it. Hayes was insistent on controlling every aspect of Jacob's treatment, especially regarding his dissociative identity disorder. Sarah frowned. What do you mean by controlling? Ethan wanted us to suppress certain aspects of Jacob's personalities, Dr. Lawson explained. He didn't want Jacob to remember things, specific events. He was terrified that if Jacob's mind pieced together certain memories, it would ruin everything. Ruin what? Sarah pressed. I never got a clear answer, Lawson admitted. But from what I gathered, Ethan was involved in something Jacob witnessed years ago. Something dark. Ethan feared that one of Jacob's personalities, the one he couldn't control, would eventually bring it all to light. Sarah's mind reeled. The missing puzzle pieces were slowly falling into place. Ethan Hayes had been trying to suppress Jacob's fractured mind because it held the key to a secret he didn't want revealed. A secret that had led to his murder. Thank you, Doctor, Sarah said, her voice tight with urgency. I need to find out what Jacob witnessed. Do you have any suggestions on how to unlock those memories? Dr. Lawson hesitated. It's dangerous, Detective. Jacob's mind is fragile. But if you're determined to uncover the truth, you'll need to access the personalities he suppressed for so long. His alternate selves hold the key. Later that evening, Sarah and Dr. Clark met once again in the psychiatric facility. Jacob sat nervously in the chair, his hands fidgeting in his lap. He had been informed that another session would be necessary, but this time, they would delve deeper into the parts of him that had been hidden for years. Jacob, Dr. Clark began softly, we need to go back to a time before the murder. Before Ethan Hayes brought you to us. We're looking for a memory, something you've forgotten. Something important. Jacob's eyes darted between Dr. Clark and Sarah, fear evident on his face. I don't know if I can do this. You can, Sarah said firmly, stepping closer. We believe you witnessed something, Jacob, something that made Ethan Hayes afraid. We need to know what it was. Jacob swallowed hard but nodded, reluctantly closing his eyes as Dr. Clark began guiding him into a deep state of relaxation. Let your mind drift back, Dr. Clark said, her voice calm and steady. You're safe here, Jacob. We're going back to a time when you were younger, before everything happened. Let the memories come to the surface. Jacob's breathing slowed, his body relaxing as the process began. Minutes passed in silence, but then his face tensed and a low, guttural voice emerged. I remember. Sarah leaned forward, her heart pounding. What do you remember, Jacob? The voice, deeper and colder than Jacob's usual tone, responded. Ethan. He was there, that night. What night? Sarah asked, her voice shaking with anticipation. The night of the fire, the voice continued. He said it would all be okay, that no one would know. But I saw everything. Sarah's blood ran cold. What did you see, Jacob? What happened that night? The voice chuckled darkly. Ethan set it all in motion. He didn't want the truth to come out, so he made sure it never would. What truth? Sarah pressed, her heart racing. What did Ethan do? There was a long pause and then the voice whispered, he killed them. The weight of those words hung in the air, thick and suffocating. Sarah's mind whirled, trying to process the revelation. Ethan Hayes had killed someone, perhaps more than one person, and Jacob had witnessed it. The fire. The murders. That was the truth Ethan had been so desperate to hide. Who did he kill, Jacob? Sarah asked, her voice barely a whisper. Them, my parents, the voice said, trembling. Ethan was their friend. But he betrayed them. They found out what he was doing, stealing from them, taking everything. When they confronted him, he set the fire. He thought it would destroy the evidence. But I saw it all. Sarah's pulse quickened. Ethan Hayes hadn't just been a friend to Jacob's family. He had murdered them and then used Jacob's fractured mind to cover it up. He had been controlling Jacob ever since, paying for his psychiatric treatment to keep him quiet, to keep his personalities from revealing the truth. Why didn't you tell anyone? Sarah asked, her voice thick with emotion. The voice in Jacob, his alternate personality, laughed bitterly. Who would believe a broken boy with a broken mind? Ethan made sure no one would ever know. But he couldn't control me forever. Sarah's mind raced, pieces of the puzzle finally clicking into place. Ethan Hayes had been hiding this secret for years, using Jacob as his pawn. But when Jacob's fractured mind had finally started to remember, Ethan had panicked. He had tried to silence the one person who knew the truth, but in doing so, he had sealed his own fate. It all made sense now. Jacob hadn't just been an unreliable witness. He had been the key to unraveling everything. As Jacob's breathing slowed and his eyes opened, the tension in the room lifted. He looked at Sarah, tears brimming in his eyes. I'm so sorry, he whispered, his voice fragile and filled with guilt. I didn't mean for any of this to happen. Sarah shook her head, placing a comforting hand on his shoulder. This wasn't your fault, Jacob. You were a victim too. In the days that followed, Sarah worked tirelessly to piece together the final evidence that would close the case for good. The fire from years ago was reopened, and forensic teams uncovered the truth hidden beneath the ashes. Ethan Hayes had indeed murdered Jacob's parents, and the cover-up had kept him safe for years, until now. Jacob was moved to a long-term care facility where he could receive the treatment he needed without fear of manipulation. Dr. Clark continued to work with him, helping him come to terms with the trauma he had endured and the truth he had uncovered. As Sarah stood by the window of her office, staring out at the city, she felt a sense of closure. The case had been one of the most difficult of her career, but justice had finally been served. Ethan Hayes had tried to bury the truth, but in the end, it had come back to haunt him. And while Jacob's mind may have been fractured, he had been the one to bring that truth to light. Sarah took a deep breath, her thoughts settling as the weight of the case began to lift. She had solved the mystery of the unreliable witness. But as with all cases, the echoes of the past would continue to linger in her mind, a reminder of the thin line between truth and deception. If you enjoyed this story, be sure to like the video, share it with others, and subscribe for more thrilling tales. Explore our playlist of psychological thrillers for more gripping stories. See you in the next story.